Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Practically Platonic. My name is Jeffrey. Hi, Sylvia.
Hey there, how you doing?
Good, thank you. So in this episode, we're going to talk about the Enneads 3-7 on eternity and time. So in this chapter, Plotinus is talking about, of course, time and eternity, and these have a very strong connection with the topics that he's outlined at great length earlier in the Enneads. And the nature of time has a strong relationship with the soul, as well as with the one. So essentially, he distinguishes eternity from time. Now, normally in colloquial English, we think of eternity as endless time. We say it takes an eternity. We might think of eternity as basically being infinite time, where there's an infinite past or an infinite future. We would say something is eternal, but it has a different sense for Plotinus. So eternity is the life that belongs to what truly is. So that would be the realm of the intelligible, which is an unchanging reality of forms. So as Plotinus has outlined and discussed at length, the intelligible realm precedes the soul. And so at the stage of the intelligible realm, which is an expression of the one, everything is complete and perfect, immutable, unchangeable. And so what that means is that there's no serialization of experience, there's no serialization of events. Everything is as it is in its entirety. So there's no actual linear time as we experience it because everything is already complete. So he says explicitly in this chapter that there is no past or present at that stage. But the soul eventually expresses the forms, and there's a temporalization process that occurs. And so time, as we experience it, is an image or a sort of changeable likeness of eternity. And it's described as a life of a soul. And the time is characterized by change, movement, and the serialization of experiences and events. So time itself is not an independent entity. It is something that arises or emerges from the motion of the soul. Plotinus also argues that time itself does not exist in the same way as physical objects, but rather it's a measure of movement concerning before and after. And he also discusses other people's positions as well, sometimes in a very complicated way, where some people say that, time is the product of measurement, or that time is measurement itself. So he also contrasts his ideas with these other authors. But what's important here is that there's a sort of soteriological aspect to his discussion. So the soul can contemplate eternity, which essentially would be a return backwards. It would be like a retrospective perspective on the emergence of time going back to eternity. And so when we think of things in a very strong temporal sense, then we're more likely to be bound in the physical world, whereas you can still reflect on eternity. So the soul is able to operate both in eternity, but also involve itself also in temporal existence. So generally, it's a very interesting discussion, I found, and it clarifies how the forms are arranged in our ordinary experienced reality, and that if you want to pursue a higher state, then inevitably you will have to consider eternity and not be bound by time. So that's my take on it. Sylvia, what do you think?
I think that he did a pretty good job, in my opinion, of presenting what he believed was meant by Plato in the Timaeus and in other books where he might bring up the concept of time and specifically eternity. I think the way he talks about eternity is very much in line with medieval Christian concepts of the eternal as presented like by Thomas Aquinas and other scholastics who obviously relied heavily on Plato. I think he does a really good job in explaining the concept of eternity. He goes on to say that, like, the previous philosophers would sometimes use the word always when talking about eternity by saying that which always is. And he explains that it's more of a way to differentiate it from the incorrect, I guess, or the illusory concept that there is an is in this material world. And he makes an example by saying, like, the way we may say philosopher versus true philosopher. Like, there's no such thing as a philosopher that's not a true philosopher, right? But because there are sophists or people who may, have the pretense of being philosophers but are indeed not philosophers, sometimes people will use that colloquialism. And he said, in the same way, that's why earlier philosophers may have used this term always, and obviously in ancient Greek or whatever other languages he was talking about, it must have been a similar term. And I really liked how he said maybe it would have been better if, instead of saying something that always is, which makes us still think of things in a temporal sense, right? Like there's a beginning and an end, or that it's infinite, because it seems like time is also infinite, but that's it's not really about infinity, as you already mentioned. It's more about there is no before or after. It just is. He says the most true thing we can say about eternity is that it is. And so he says that instead of saying that it is that which always is, it is better to say that which is truly is.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and this is my understanding of the text, is that in the material world, in the perceptible universe that you and I live in, that is bound by time, because time, again, is, as you said, one of the essences. It's a nature of the soul, and the universe is within, the soul, right? And within time. Therefore, we're constantly, he says, things within time are constantly becoming. We never are. We're always going towards something, right? It's almost as if time, he does say it, that time is an image of eternity, in the same way that the material things here are an image of the intelligible forms. So in the same way, it is imperfect, because as he describes, like the soul wanting to go off and do its own thing, it created time, but I almost perceive it as the wholeness that is eternity cannot exist in this realm. Therefore, it's almost as if time, which may there be infinite nonetheless, can only be is only particulars, right? It can't be whole. It has to be particulars, as if the wholeness of eternity were to be broken up throughout the infinity of time. And he does speak near the end to at least this is my understanding. It was not 100% clear, and he doesn't really stop on this for too long, but that time is infinite. And again, he talks to, like, don't confuse this concept of infiniteness with eternity. It's not the same thing, right? Because the soul is infinite, or also eternal, and I think he hints to something that I was already thinking. Well, in his little explanation, like at a certain point, the soul wanted to be something other than what it already was, or where it already was. And he points back to earlier, the notes point back to earlier in the book, and I went back to look, and it's basically where the intellect or where the soul is stimulated by the intellect to create. So obviously, for things to be created, there needs to be motion in this realm, the perceivable universe. There needs to be movement, because otherwise there would not be the kind of creation that the soul is able to create. And if there's this kind of movement, it needs time. So that kind of explains what he leaves more vague in this chapter, of that it had this impetus to create time, and therefore it did.
Mm-hmm.
But my point is this. But my point was, like, the soul did that, but it being within eternity, it's not like it did it at a certain point in time, because it's outside of time. It was outside of time at the point in which it did it. So in that sense, time has also always existed in this realm or dimension, or whatever we want to call it. The difference then is always just that everything isn't at once in time. It is linear. that's really the difference, not about the extent of it, which is not even a relevant concept within eternity. And in that sense, going back to my initial point of how it very much reminds me of the Christian concept of God, or of what, outside of timeness, that God is eternal. And he speaks of God too, it's a different God perhaps, but that the oneness of God, which is also the definition of the term God, even in other languages, very much always indicates to this eternality, this outside of timeness of, and in that sense, eternity, as he says, is also, it is an intrinsic aspect of the intellect of the one, and it's inseparable from it.
Right, right. So building on what you're saying, I'll point to page 338, where in the translation, Plotinus says, "The sensible universe too has need of a goal at which it will aim in the same way. For this reason, it hastens to what is going to be and does not want to stand still as it drags its existence along in its effort to be constantly producing something different and going round in a circle in a desire for substantiality. And with that, we have discovered the explanation for the sort of motion that tends to everlasting existence by means of what is to come." So effectively, the soul is attempting to express the forms, but it's doing it in a sort of crude manner and as best it can. So you end up with the fragmentation of the forms and the serialization of events, and also the inevitable change from one form to another in matter in particular, which, as we've explored before, is incorporeal, non-existent. But because it is incorporeal and non-existent, that also means that it's rapidly changeable as well, depending on the forms that have descended and its interaction with our perception of them. So what this is saying basically is that the soul is trying to express eternity, but it's doing it in a much more limited manner than it would be able to do at a higher level. But when you get to the material realm, you're dealing with a much, how do you say, more fragmentary and limited mode of expression and existence. So it's basically, the second best or the third best option for expressing the forms. And so we end up with the temporalization of the forms, as the soul effectively, as it says, has a goal and it's aiming to do something. It's basically attempting to acquire or return to that sort of substantiality, which is the certainty of the intelligible realm. So we end up with basically a non-static material world that's constantly changing. And so what that means at a personal level is that we as well can become part of this process, and also to see in the process of change and the process of the unfolding of time what the soul is doing. And there's a sort of work in progress, and it's actually aimed at something much higher.
Right. But it seems like it's something that is unachievable by the very nature of its existence. It's kind of the irony that for action and creation to even exist, to have even been, for the soul to even have created creation as we know it within the universe we live in, the compromise was the fragmentary nature of the material world and the fragmentary nature of time. So it appears as if it's constantly trying to chase after being everything that eternity is, like you said, but that's impossible because eternity is everything at once without a before and after. But the very nature of time is that things must be linear. So it can only be, it's never able to be everything at once by the nature of time. And I think that there's something interesting about the human condition in this concept that the compromise of action and creation here is the loss of something, which I think anyone who's ever done anything in life knows that whenever you go to do something, you're always going to compromise something. You're always going to do something imperfectly. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. The very condition of all of humanity and are moving forward in whatever humanity believes its goal is in a way, is this, it seems to be this eternal and forever imperfect quest. And on the other side of this, in many religions, the very act of inaction has been the way to kind of like, by not acting, your action, as I guess he's not really talking about inaction here, but by orienting oneself back toward the good and the one and trying to contemplate eternity. He says, if, for example, a philosopher were to actually be able to contemplate eternity unceasingly, they would actually be able to partake more fully in eternity. And I'm sure there are various Eastern practices, and I'm sure they exist in other parts of the world as well, where this idea of like not acting is really the way to orient yourself towards something more real or perfect or whole. And just the very nature of like how time actually works and how like just real mundane human condition actually functions. It all like, it's all so similar, right? It's all so connected.
Right. So, I mean, what comes to mind is maybe Taoism, where they have
Yeah.
this idea of non-action. Whether it's ultimately comparable to this or not, I'm not sure. But as a practice, just being able to step away from the vicissitudes of time and our obsession with it is probably meaningful. Buddhism, on the other hand, is interesting because Buddhism fundamentally believes in time and causality. And long story short, Buddhism believes that we have infinite past lives and you'll continue to have infinite future lives unless you achieve nirvana.
Right.
And what that means is that time is an absolute. Now, where there is some challenge to the concept of time is in Mahayana philosophy, where they argue that all phenomena are empty, which means that they don't have any sort of inherent existence.
Right.
So everything arises due to causes and conditions, and then time would be no exception to that. But that's actually more of an epistemological argument rather than ontological. So Plotinus is effectively dealing with what exists, and he has a very, complex ontological structure to his whole discussion of time that builds on, the one, the intelligible, the soul, and
Right.
material and matter.
But what you mentioned about the Mahayana belief system reminds me of his take on material, on the nature of, on the nature of matter, and that it's fundamentally like non-existence.
Well,
then
so in Mahayana,
different?
it's different because in Mahayana there is an idea that there's conventional reality. And so in conventional reality, you and I exist as individual persons. There is time, there is space, there is the elements. But then at the level of the ultimate reality, which is epistemological, you understand that all of these things are empty. It doesn't mean that they're non-existent. It just means that you see them as illusory, just as you would see phantoms on a screen.
But how is that really that different than what he's saying? And like overall in this, I could see how at least the translation I'm reading, you could say that he's saying this.
I think it's a difference between ontology and epistemology, in my opinion. So what exists versus how we perceive things. And I feel
isn't he saying that we're perceiving things a certain way, that truly even that the images aren't even real? They're just,
well, they're crude images. Yes. I mean, I guess you could come to a similar soteriological.
I'm not saying it's identical, but
right. You can come to
you
can come to a similar view, maybe even a spiritual view, that our perceptions of phenomena are illusory. But basically, I think the main difference is one of, Buddhists explaining how we perceive things, because how you perceive things is the source of suffering. Because if you believe that something truly exists, then you're likely to have emotional reactions as a result of, old age, sickness, dying, and death, losing things you cherish, and coming into contact with things you despise. Whereas Plotinus, his whole structure here is one of existence. So
I don't know if I agree with that. I think he does say that things as we perceive them, even like the concept of all the concepts of things that should cause suffering, he's kind of made arguments about how they're not really how we perceive them, that it's just a mechanism of our base instinct, our material, our existence in this. Fundamentally, it's a material because it's changing and corruptible and eventually goes away, our body and our mind here. I mean, I think there's differences, obviously, for a lot of reasons, but I think there's a lot of, I think he talks about it maybe a little differently, but I think he's fundamentally saying that, not that this doesn't exist, it does, but it's an illusory, it's an image, it's not real, it's not really even who we are.
So this is where I would point out that, so for Plotinus, matter is illusory,
Right?
but the forms are real.
Yeah, but the forms are part of the ultimate reality. It's not here. We can contemplate them. I don't even know if we can contemplate them, but we can contemplate that we know that they exist, and we can we can try to start contemplating aspects of, like, particulars of the way they manifest within this universe. But I guess the way I see it is that this universe is the equivalent of what you're saying is the illusory universe in the Mahayana tradition, and that the intelligible realm and the one are part of the ultimate reality that humans can be. You don't think that's how the structure is?
No, because in Buddhism, ultimate reality is not a place; it's a perspective.
Well, you think that's a place? I don't think it's a place.
No, ultimate reality in Buddhism is how things are, how things truly are if you have the correct perspective.
But how is that not the case? Because all the forms are truly just the pure ideas of things. It's not really I don't think it's like a place, a material place. It's like something we can't conceive.
But under Buddhist analysis, they would also argue that whatever sort of mental constructs you have are also empty. So the whole idea is that you don't, the word is reify. You don't reify anything, nothing material, nothing mental, nothing emotional, psychological, nothing. You don't reify anything. And from that comes like wisdom and eventually liberation.
So total nothing. So nothingness.
It's not nihility, no. Because
then what is it? It's unknowable. At least
it's basically soteriological. So what I mean by that is that it is supposed to bring about spiritual liberation. So for the Mahayana Buddhist, the idea is that you understand that conventional reality exists as we experience it. Unless you're crazy, we experience the same reality more or less.
Right.
Like we both see the apple. We can agree on that. But the problem is that we become attached to our conventional notions, and then all sorts of emotional and behavioral problems result from that.
But thus far, I think he's saying similar things so far in your.
I know, and so recently I've written a paper about Buddhist and Neoplatonic cosmologies, and I argue that fundamentally they're very different.
Okay, I guess I'll have to go read it. I know you sent it to me, and I haven't had time to read it.
Right. So eventually, maybe we could discuss.
Yeah, we can do an episode on that.
Right, but going back to Plotinus and this quote that I gave. So basically, we're in ordinary reality, we're living in a sort of fragmented realm where you do have the forms, but it's not all of them in their totality. You get a sort of fragmented taste of them over the course of your lifespan, and there's a serialization of them. Whereas at the intelligible realm, there's no serialization, so they all just simultaneously are, and there's no need for before or after. So, but what that also means is that if our experience of temporality is really just a limited experience of what truly is, then we have to try to step out of linear time and try to conceive of a higher or the true reality, which is eternity.
Right. So you can be our true self, because he says that things in the temporal realm are deficient because they're always coming into being, which means they're never totally what they are. They're only a little bit, and then they're changing. And then, like, for example, and this is how I understood it, but it could apply to a lot of things, but as an example, 20-year-old Jeff, the things and who you were at 20, you no longer are, because now you're however old you are now, in your later 30s. So in a sense, like and that's like a question people ask me, like who we are is constantly changing, or who we are, at least psychologically and in this world, but perhaps our true self would be the totality of everything potentially possible that we will ever be and have ever been, all at once. Maybe that would be like our, and I'm applying this to people, our true self. And he kind of says that we're always deficient because we're never all of our self. And obviously our true self isn't even like the persona that we experience here. It's some deeper thing, but there is an aspect, of the intellect that reflects the true soul that is embodied, which perhaps is, since his idea, like Plato's, is that we're remembering things. What comes out, like as we develop as a person, how we change, it's only these fragments of the true embodied of the soul. It can only, when embodied, only comes out a little bit at a time, and we lose some of it, right? As you change, you lose things and gain new things. So there's always a deficiency to the totality of the self, which if we, like you said, if we were to be able to orient ourselves toward contemplating the totality of things, that would, and being one with that, we would also be able to start to grasp, or ideally grasp, being the true totality of ourselves and not being deficient.
It's also, you wouldn't need to be so concerned with oneself, because you
Right.
you realize that you're just a limited experience in temporality.
You'd be part of
Right.
the whole, the one.
Right. So, I mean, to a certain extent, there would be a sort of detachment from your
Right.
ordinary self. And maybe it might be a cure for, I don't know, narcissistic tendencies as well.
I think it could be a cure for a lot of the different feelings, even, what we consider healthy, psychologically healthy people are just, the tragedy of life, the tragedy of change. I think we all experience this, the loss that happens as we change and grow and lose things and learn new things. I think it's part of everything, isn't it? I don't know if I'm making any sense now, but it would take away the fear of changing and of having changed, and the sadness or the nostalgia or the turmoil we have with things changing, which often also relates to our relationships to others, because we're so, at least in this reality, psychologically affected by our relations with others and how they influence our life and our perspective.
Yeah. I mean, there's just one aspect of time that we have to inevitably face with, which
Right.
is old age and decay and death. And
Yes.
so the people that we loved, if you're old enough, the people you loved 30 years ago, how many of those people that you knew 30 years ago are still around, like your grandparents, your great grandparents? And
But even
eventually,
the
we're
nature,
also faced,
right.
we're faced with this in
But
reality.
even before death, like even the kind of like bittersweetness we have about concept of friends we've lost, or people that we used to be close to, and for various reasons we no longer are, because they've changed and we've changed. Relationships, both romantic and platonic, all of that, there's this constant change, and it's part of the small tragedies of life also before death. I think if we were actually able to orient ourselves toward the true wholeness of ourself, which is ourself and also everything else, that that tragedy would disappear, because it would, by the very nature of what all of the loss that we perceive because of time and change would no longer be. Everything would be at once, including us and them and everything.
So
If that makes sense.
so Plotinus frames this reality of time and all of its tragedies and everything as just being an inevitable expression of the soul.
Right.
The successor to Plotinus, Iamblichus, I think, understands it more as like part of the design, that it's actually not something that's really all that tragic, but it's actually just basically part of the intelligent design of the universe. So there's also a difference there, where you could understand time as not being, incidental or inevitable, but actually it's part of the whole
Well, I don't think he says it's I'm saying that, like, as a human being, we do experience these things as difficult, because we do. I don't think Plotinus, at least in this chapter, ever specifically qualifies it as a negative. I mean, it's only negative insofar that there's an inherent deficiency to it in relation to eternity, which is the eternal, which is perfect. But he also doesn't think he also thinks the soul is perfect and that
Mhm.
it's doing what it's supposed to. So I don't think that what you're saying of Iamblichus and Plotinus necessarily are contradictory. Perhaps he simply just kind of fleshed some of the unspoken things out a little bit more. Because I
Mhm.
certainly would not come away from this thinking that it's a bad thing or something like the Gnostics might think that it's like a
Well,
downfall. I
not so
could
much.
see it being part
Not
of a
not
design. He just doesn't address it, I don't think,
more
but it's part of the nature of how it's
uh,
supposed to be.
so my understanding is Plotinus is saying that time is a inevitable byproduct rather
Right.
than being it. Well, I mean, earlier in the book, that's how he describes the expression of the forms through the soul and the material world. It's an inevitable expression out of necessity. It has to, in order for the system to make any sense, it's just an inevitable expression. But then somebody like Iamblichus might have said that, in fact, the whole process of time is actually intentional. It's actually, there's a sort of divine intention behind it. And so, I mean, so for Plotinus, the idea would be like, don't focus so much on time, orient yourself toward eternity. Whereas for the more polytheistic Iamblichus, he might have said something like, actually, don't turn away from it. That doesn't mean you have to, like, embrace it like an ordinary person, but to understand it as basically one aspect of our
Right.
reality that is actually designed by and implemented by a divine will.
To be
So
able to actually understand and be resilient in dealing with the facts of reality and of life, I assume, in a sense, right?
right. I mean, I guess to a certain extent, you could say that Plotinus is proposing effectively an escape plan. Like if you orient yourself toward eternity, toward the one, towards the intelligible realm, that you'll be
Mm.
liberated from the sort of shackles of material reality. Which, I mean, the idea of liberation is something that you find in, for example, Christianity. You find it in Buddhism, this idea that there's actually something wrong with this reality that we're experiencing, and that you are entitled to find or
See, I interpret it though that he thinks that's part of the plan, that like it's a loop, that we are supposed to reorient ourselves and return. That's how the loop closes. He hasn't explicitly said that at any point, but I could see how that's part of the design. I think we also you have to also think about, I don't know very much about Iamblichus, but we have to take into consideration what these people's alleged life experiences were. I don't know what Iamblichus and their life experiences and life context is. Hypothetically, this guy says he had, or his followers said he had states of enlightenment multiple times in life in which he was able to perceive or be in the intelligible realm multiple times. Whether or not we believe this is irrelevant, but how he got there, why he got there,
right.
is
But the
obviously
point is,
informing like him having that as like something that he's
and that's
focusing on.
that's the ideal. I think if
Yeah,
you take him seriously and you read his works, that you want to
right.
replicate the same experience in yourself.
So I guess what was Iamblichus's, like, what do you know, like, briefly, of like kind of the context of what he experienced or where he was coming from? I know that he was also a follower of Plotinus, or
Well, I'm saying that
generation.
his perspective seems to have been more of one act of actually effectively respecting our ordinary reality as
Right,
a product of divine will. So
right.
there's a difference there between an inevitable expression. The world is an inevitable expression, an automatic expression even, and assuming that there's a divine will underlying all of this. So
I,
they're
I think. Sorry, go
different
ahead.
perspective. Yeah, there's they had different perspectives on this. They're not incompatible, but they did have
No.
different perspectives.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes. I just meant that I don't think they're necessarily incompatible. I think you could take this and elaborate to come to the conclusions Iamblichus came to. But from what little you've told me so far, I could also see, because of course there's different schools of thought and different perspectives on different parts of their own like history and story. But like I could see how his perspective is also very Christian. Or not that he's Christian, but like how Christians also have this idea that like the world we live in, it's actually part of this divine plan, and we're supposed to actually figure out how to, not try to escape it, but live here righteously as part of, especially especially a lot of Reformation religions,
Hmm.
that this is all providence. There's some bigger plan for why all of this is happening, even though a lot of it appears to be corrupt, or even despite the fact that the world may be a fallen world, but there's a whole divine plan on how everything's going to work out. That to some degree, even though we should orient ourselves toward God or Jesus, or behave like Jesus, I guess that's the big part. Like I think the idea of the Godhead having come down in a human form is kind of an indication of living your life here, but like living it righteously. I don't know if I'm just saying how I could see many Christians having interpreted that throughout history, and that being an easy interpretation to come to. Obviously, I'm not speaking for all Christians. There's so many denominations and personal ideas out there, just like there is with all religions. But I could definitely, and especially he came, how much later was he on? Because just like 100 years?
No, he was in the following generation.
Oh, do you know if he was actually a pupil?
Yeah, he was.
Oh, he was a pupil. Okay. And Christianity already existed at the time, so it was probably even more strong by the time he was elderly.
Right. Well, I mean, there is discussion that people like Plotinus and Iamblichus and, Proclus and so forth were reacting to Christianity.
I think Christians and them and everybody was reacting to the socioeconomic situations and the global crisis that they were experiencing. I think that's why these kinds of ethical and ontological beliefs came to be, right? And the Gnostics and whoever else, other things that no longer even exist and are not very well documented.
So maybe as a final question, one thing I was thinking about was, how would Plotinus understand, if he had known about it, time dilation? And so time dilation is a actual documented reality where the closer you are to a gravitational mass, the slower time is. And this is actually a reality. So satellites have they record time on their atomic clocks different in very, fractions of nanoseconds, different from the clocks on Earth. So we actually do know that time, the experience of time, the passage of time, is not absolute in all environments. So I was kind of thinking, like, how would Plotinus have understood that, or how would he have interpreted that?
How he would have interpreted it? I think in the book, doesn't he believe that it's the measurement of time is perfectly evened out? It's like, I forget what term he uses, that that the metric of it is even. There's equal amounts of difference between whatever metric of time, but his deductions are just rationalistic. They're not empirical. And what we're talking about is empirical. So I don't see how he could argue with that being a fact if presented. He seems like someone who is a rational person who, no pun intended, who would, I guess what he thinks, I don't know that he would think that it necessarily affects his overall idea, because he would say, nonetheless, even though there's the physics of the material world, which objects in it interact in different ways, and the spheres or certain spheres interact with time, perhaps he would think that it's actually the spheres and the objects that are being affected by time and not the other way around. And in any case, he would say, nonetheless, motion and change is still occurring. There is no wholeness. There's no eternal happening. So it's just like a slight change due to like physics within this world. But I don't think I think he'd find it maybe interesting, but I don't think and it might like affect maybe his like whatever physics he had about like this universe, but I don't think it really affects his like metaphysics, because it's still change within, because still like, even though it slows down or it can go faster, things are still changing. Like it's still moving forward. It doesn't stop.
It's just that it's not a constant. Like this,
Right. Oh, yeah, exactly. That's the word I was looking for.
the passage of time is not constant depending on what sort of gravitational environment you find yourself in.
Right.
So,
Well, he also does say that he doesn't seem as he doesn't seem to prioritize so much like the nature of times from a standpoint of physics, like some of the people he's talking or he's disagreeing with, who seem to like the Stoics and the Epicureans, and I don't remember who else he's talking, Pythagoreans, who talk about like, oh, time is like an aspect of physics, like it's how you measure motion, or it's how you basically either that it is motion or that it's how you measure motion, or it is the measure of motion, but all like kind of like fundamentally physics concepts, erroneous or not. Whereas he's like, well, none of this, he's kind of like, that doesn't matter. This is really what it is. He's more interested with the origin story of time, and simply the fact that because of things are constantly changing and never whole, which I don't think any of these other people really disagree with that concept. They just think it's something less that doesn't really have a metaphysical nature, or at least they don't talk about one.
Right. Okay, well, it's an interesting point to consider. So, with that in mind, I think we can wrap up. And so thank you everybody for listening. The next chapter will be on nature, contemplation, and the one.